Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting for fear of little men. Wee folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and white owl's feather. Down along the rocky shore some make their home. They live on crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam. Some in the reeds of the black mountain lake, with frogs for their watchdog, with with frogs for their watchdogs all night awake. That's the beginning of The Fairies from William Allingham's 1850 poems. Despite its seemingly friendly opening, the poem quickly turns dark, describing how a girl named Bridget is abducted for 7 years to the fairy realm and then returned dead from sorrow. The fairies, Allingham writes, quote, thought she was fast asleep, unquote. She's then kept deep inside lakes. What does it mean that the fairies eat crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam? It reminds me of Joe Simonton's pancakes, which Jeff discussed in the last episode. Hat tip to him for bringing my attention to this line in the poem. The poem suggests that sea foam is in some way enchanted, or perhaps that it nourishes enchantment, but a dark enchantment associated with danger, death, and sorrow. Sea foam is common in religious literature, art, fairy tales, and folklore around the world. Before moving to this next example, just a warning, it gets pretty graphic and sexual pretty quick. In Hesiod's Theogony, written in the 8th century BCE, Gaia, the goddess of the earth, who is described by the text as wicked, is angry with Uranos, god of the sky. This is because he hates some of his children and hides them inside of the earth. So at her behest, Cronus cuts off the genitals of Uranos, as Uranos covers Gaia in the night to sleep with her. From the blood of Uranos, Gaia births the Erinyes or Furies, and the tree nymphs called Melii in Hesiod's telling. Meanwhile, quote, soon after the genitals were cut by the sickle and thrown into the agitated sea, they were carried through the water for a long time, and a white foam sprang from the deathless flesh, and inside grew a young woman. First she came to sacred Cuthera, and then to sea-bathed Cyprus, where a beautiful goddess emerged with grass growing around her slender feet. Gods and mortals called her Aphrodite, for she was born from the sea foam, and fair-crowned Cutherea, for she reached Cuthera, and also Cuprogenes, for she was born on sea-bathed Cyprus, and Philomedes, for she sprang from genitals. Eros followed her, and fair Hemeros stayed with her from the moment she was born until she joined the race of the gods. She had this honor from the beginning and obtained by lot from humans and immortal gods the secrets, smiles, deceptions, sweet delights, friendliness, and gentleness of young women. Unquote. Hesiod, what were you thinking? This is a terrible Mother's Day story. Okay, I didn't write this for Mother's Day anyway. That's from a 2021 translation by Michael Hoyman, of whom I know very little else about. But it seemed to work well here, as in this myth, sea foam is sometimes a creative force with clear sexual connotations surrounding it. Though the sea foam itself often plays a procreative role, there is something male or masculine about many of these stories. As it turns out, that's because they often have portrayals of male characters operating phallic-looking weapons to create sea foam or in combination with sea foam. In the case of Cronus, this even involves castration. On the other hand, sea foam may also be a tricky force associated with demons out to deceive and exploit. In a folk tale about the creation of the land recounted from Bukovina, the devil first appears to God in a solid piece of sea foam on the ocean. This could be interpreted in light of the Epistle of Jude, in which it says of ungodly people, quote, They are wild waves of the sea, foaming up their shame, unquote. In any case, in the story, the devil tricks God into creating the land. This is also a rare instance where we are treated to see foam in the heavens, as the devil is taken into the sky. The Phoenician philosopher Porphyry tells another version of this story in which Satanael is portrayed as a diving bird. This story is also reminiscent of two very different stories from Japan. In the Kojiki, a 712 foundational Shinto work that contains early Japanese myths and legends, the island of Onogoro is created from the froth dripping from a spear after the spear has stirred the sea. And from a perhaps later story, a folk tale, a carpenter tries to rebuild a bridge that keeps falling down. An ogre called Oniroku appears to him in the foam floating on the surface of the river and says he'll help the carpenter rebuild the bridge so that it won't fall again in exchange for his eyeballs. The carpenter can only escape this fate, though, if he can guess the demon's name. There's something very UFO adjacent about that kind of situation. Oniroku spends part of the story unidentified by name, and identifying him prevents the carpenter's blindness. In another ancient myth from South Asia, Indra slays the powerful serpent demon called Vritra. In the version of this story from the Mahabharata, he does this with the use of sea foam combined with his thunderbolt. The foam is effective, according to this account, because it doesn't belong to any of the four ancient elements. It is neither wet nor is it dry, it's frothy. In the fairy tale The Little Mermaid, written by Hans Christian Andersen and first published in 1837, sea foam plays a very important role in the story. This is because when mermaids die, they dissolve into sea foam, and their soul also dies. The heroine of this story, the Little Mermaid, has the opportunity to return from the human world to her life under the sea by killing the man she loves, but she can't do it. She casts the knife into the ocean, and, quote, the water turned red where it fell, and the drops that spurted up looked like blood. She cast one more lingering, half fainting glance at the prince, and then threw herself from the ship into the sea, and thought her body was dissolving into foam. The sun rose above the waves, and his warm rays fell on the cold foam of the little mermaid, who did not feel as if she were dying. She saw the bright sun, and all around her floated hundreds of transparent, beautiful beings. She could see through them the white sails of the ship and the red clouds in the sky. Their speech was melodious, but too ethereal to be heard by mortal ears, as though they were also seen by mortal eyes. The little mermaid perceived that she had a body like theirs, and that she continued to rise higher and higher out of the foam. "Where am I?" asked she, and her voice sounded ethereal, as the voice of those who were with her. No earthly music could imitate it. Unquote. Because of her good deeds, LM is rescued from dissolving into sea foam at the moment of her death. She's lifted into the realm of air spirits, who are given 300 years to earn a human soul by doing good deeds and bringing life-restoring air to people in need. Anderson places the role of sea foam as the end of life and the beginning of a strange afterlife. In the act of turning into sea foam, LM is instantly transmuted into air. Thus, she is transmuted from a sea spirit into an air spirit. Unlike in many of the above accounts, with the possible exception of Vritra's death, sea foam serves directly as a passage from the world of the living to the world beyond. It acts as the literal vehicle for the Little Mermaid's travel from the Earth world to the Sky world. And in this travel between worlds, she meets and even becomes like other beings who live in the sky. So we can liken sea foam to flying saucers in a narrative sense, Because just as flying saucer lore involves aliens and travel to other worlds by means of flying saucers and other spacecraft, the Little Mermaid travels to the world of humans and of air spirits by shape-shifting. But when she travels into the sky, she does so by means of sea foam, where she encounters the sky's inhabitants, transparent beings who can influence the wind and who speak in an ethereal language. They serve in this story as analogs of UFO aliens, while seafoam serves as the vehicle from one world to another, just like a flying saucer. But what is seafoam? I became interested in seafoam last year when I began wondering if there were naturally occurring spheres that fly through the sky carried by the wind, like naturally occurring balloons, i.e., natural bubbles floating in the air. So far, I have found two examples of things similar to this, but not quite identical. Perhaps the weirdest example is of the bubbles that are formed from the bubble bush or Barbados nut tree, Jatropha curcas, endemic to the tropics of the Americas. One can take a stem and snap it, and then blow bubbles from the oily sap inside, which shares chemical properties with soap's suds. The same substance is used in the production of biofuel. So far, however, the bubble bush bubbles are the only example I've found of naturally occurring individual spherical bubbles, and even then, the only known cases I found so far were video recordings, all examples of bubbles produced by people intervening to deliberately snap the stem and blow the bubbles. Therefore, they are made by human hands. Listeners, please let me know in the comments if you happen to be aware of any examples of individual bubbles that float in the air naturally without any kind of human intervention. The only other example that I found is natural, does float in the air by being carried by wind, and is somehow quite magical. But it doesn't occur in the form of individual spherical bubbles, and that is, of course, sea foam, or potentially foam on rivers or lakes. Really, any naturally occurring foam that's light enough will do. Unlike soap bubbles or bubble bush bubbles, foam is often much more stable because it's made up of many small bubbles, all stuck together. Likely for this very reason, sea foam, along with other sorts of liquid foams, is actually pretty common. There are wide varieties of foam that form from different materials floating in liquids, and foam will form under various different circumstances. While many aquatic foams are produced by industrial waste, many others are produced from organic material like soil or algae. Sometimes toxic algal blooms will result in large floods of foam. Some foam might even be produced by minerals like particles of silicon or heavy metals. Foam has many names, just in English alone. Spume, froth, scum, surf, suds, and fizz are a few. Seafoam is just one class of foams. Foam doesn't happen just in pure water, and not all substances in water can help produce foam. It arises in the interface between the air and the water, or what is called the surface microlayer in Star Trek Technobabble. This is the surface between the water and air, and it's where particles, debris, and microorganisms can collect from both above and below. In particular, surfactants will collect in this layer. These are molecules that are repelled by water on one end and attracted to water on the other end. When this layer gets agitated by waves, wind, rapid force, etc., it forms small bubbles that these surfactants help keep from popping immediately. The foam that results tends to collect stuff from the water like contaminants or organic matter, sort of like a sponge. So foam can actually help naturally cleanse bodies of water, but it can also be dangerous if it contains a lot of toxic materials. As a result, governments sometimes have to pass laws regulating industrial foam production. Because of how common and diverse seafoam and aquatic foams are, they actually help shape ecosystems. Not only can some seafoams be toxic and dangerous for life to be around, some can also be a source of food and serve as their own very own self contained habitats for tiny critters. Much like in the stories, seafoam in real life is a protective and potentially deadly substrate, a sort of miniature and intermediate realm marked both by birth and by death. So it's only natural that scientists study it extensively, as shown in the paper by Katharina Schilling and Matthias Zessner, Foam in the Aquatic Environment, which I relied on heavily for this piece and which looks at a lot of research that's been done on the topic. Another paper was published on May Day in the journal Marine Environmental Research, which looks at how a particular species of periwinkle, a type of sea snail, responds to marine foams. Apparently, these foams cause the periwinkles to increase their metabolism and become more active, or else they will simply avoid the spume entirely, according to this new study. But the question on all of our minds, or at least the question on my mind, is there ever a U foam? Can sea foam result in UFO sightings? And what I mean by this is, can people ever spot sea foam flying through the air, have no idea what it is, and then report it as a UFO or even a fleet of UFOs? And I would also add to this question two more. One, does flying sea foam ever in fact get unknowingly reported as a UFO? And two, are there truly unconventional forms of flying sea foams, uncharted by science? But I won't keep you in suspense. At least I won't to some small extent. I will largely be keeping you in suspense. Setting our first question aside for a moment, I do not have answers to these last two questions. It would take a great deal of time and effort to locate and positively identify flying sea foam in the annals of UFO reports and other accounts of aerial marvels. Only if we can positively correlate a report's features with those of flying sea foam, and we can show that there was a large body of sea foam nearby that was in fact being carried to an altitude of yards or perhaps more in the air, can we say, yes, there is a UFO report that in all probability can be explained by flying sea foam. It's a hard ask, but it's one I find fascinating. Question number two is all the more difficult to answer because we might not even know what we're looking for. Seafoam is diverse in both kind and in behavior. I haven't found any scientific literature specifically on the topic of flying seafoam, so who's to say how diverse flying seafoam even is, and also what sorts of behaviors it might have? For example, does flying seafoam ever burn while flying? Does it ever contain lighter than air gases that allow it to float upwards into the air without being propelled by the wind? What happens when it gets ionized? Could there be plasma seafoams? These questions can't be answered simply through report collection, but they would also require field documentation, or at the very least, experimental demonstration. That is, either field scientists would have to film and capture examples of exotic flying sea foams, or else they would have to create flying sea foams using conditions that replicate natural ones. Now, let's return to our first question, though. Can people see flying sea foam, and can this result in a UFO report? And the answer to this question is yes, but with a caveat. First of all, people can and do see sea foam, so yes, people can mistake flying sea foam for a UFO in theory. It just has never been documented. Because, first of all, sea foam does fly, and it can do so in quantity. There are many well documented instances of seafoam floods where a storm causes large amounts of the stuff to fill bays, beaches, or coastal towns. In early April, a nor'easter hit the coast of Massachusetts and also brought with it floods of sea foam that blanketed coastal towns like Marshmallow. Sheets of sea foam can even be deadly. In 2020, 5 experienced surfers tragically lost their lives when they got caught in algal sea foam while surfing in The Hague in the Netherlands. So, wind can also simply pick up bits, clouds, or even big clumps of foam and simply carry it right up into the air. In February of this year, spume was whipped up into the air in Santa Cruz, California, as seen in this video. In this video, someone posted in 2014, you can see sea foam as it gets picked up momentarily in eddies of wind. It causes me to wonder what would happen if a seafoam flood was hit by a small whirlwind, which then dragged seafoam in a vortex over land. And I've got one more for y'all. This video shows a thick flood of seafoam that entrenched the streets of Aberdeen in 2012. One can clearly see a big old blob of seafoam shooting straight up out of frame and beyond the height of the buildings. I want to wait for it here. I don't want to leave out the best part. Okay, it's about to watch. Oh, there it goes. Did you see that? All right. It's quite clear that seafoam can form into fairly sizable objects and it can be carried by the wind with ease. According to Schilling and Zessner, hardier seafoam can last for hours before falling apart completely. So the question is only really how far inland the seafoam can get carried before completely disappearing, or alternatively, how close can someone get to a seafoam flood without being aware of its presence? If someone witnesses flying chunks of seafoam far inland, or for some other reason without any indicators of any seafoam being present nearby, especially any foam of a kind that is particularly unusual in its color or properties, or even simply viewed in an unusual light like the light of the sunset, it seems to me quite plausible that they could come away convinced that they saw a shape-shifting UFO from outer space or some other unseen realm. Seafoam chunks can fly in large numbers, change shape, and dissipate. And if that seafoam happens to be of a kind that science has never described, then we're basically talking about a bona fide Heinekian UFO. Am I speculating? A little bit, yes. But not so far outside of reason that these don't make for reasonable hypotheses. Well within the realm of possibility. So why should you care about seafoam? Why I think this all matters, seafoam and the like, is that seafoam is basically a part of the UFO myth. But I don't mean what other people mean by UFO myth here. What I mean by the UFO myth is not the myth of a secret government program that collects crashed UFO debris. No, that's really just one small, itsy bitsy, tiny myth that emerged in modern culture and sort of just became really popular through comics, movies, newspapers, and popular books. No, I'm talking about a UFO myth that's always existed in many different parts of the world, the myth of the oversaucer. Mic drop. That's right, folks, I'm talking about all of the myths of any sort of other entities living in any other sort of realm, oftentimes flying, oftentimes donning the shape of a flying light or a flying animal, oftentimes even abducting people or in some other way transporting them to another realm. Before saucer lore, it was Fort's Super Sargasso Sea. Before that, it was airships and mysterious airship pilots. Before that, it was spirits, enchanted beings, and gods. Really, it still is all that other stuff. And what everyone refers to as the quote-unquote UFO truth is just a very small part of that much vaster, much more ancient over-saucer lore. In parts largely forgotten and in parts unknown because it hasn't even been created yet. You see, the over-saucer is not itself a saucer. It's something far vaster and darker, which fully surrounds and dwarfs all saucers. What's most interesting is not that we can replace the saucers and NHI narrative with an entirely different one of seafoam and entities of pretty much any kind. It's that we can replace it with any of countless other comparable narratives that have existed since the beginning of history all over the world, or even just new ones that we make up. Like Anderson, we can tailor these myths to suit our needs. Time-traveling airships and Verne-esque inventors, witch lights and witches, spook lights and spooks, gods and chariots of said gods, sundry extremely rare preternatural phenomena hiding in the noise, and the witnesses themselves, flying pancakes and tiny pancake makers that fly atop them, were owls, lighter than air algal balloons piloted by crabs, sky fungus and ball lightning, the sky's Olympkin, and so forth. Seafoam is just one example of a new narrative, but it's also not an entirely arbitrary one or even a new one. Just as saucers are emblematic of the sky and aliens, seafoam is emblematic of birth and death and an unfathomable realm that may be inhabited by or even give birth to demons, gods, and spirits. Like UFO lore, seafoam lore can be tailored to suit our needs. It can even be a symbol of rebirth, like the phoenix, and it is in the end something that's a bit mysterious in our skies. It's an example of something that could plausibly be seen by someone and reported as a close encounter sighting of a glistening red, shape-shifting UFO, or even a fleet of UFOs at sunset. What other mysterious things can be seen in the sky? After all, regardless of what happens or whatever any disclosure bro says, there will always be uncountable natural mysteries further west. Nature is a stranger yet. The ones that cite her most have never passed her haunted house nor simplified her ghost. To pity those that know her not is helped by the regret that those who know her less the nearer her they get. Emily Dickinson.